White people are pissed over their own white folks. And that is because of what this woman literally said. That is because this woman literally broke tables. And I feel like this is very important for every single person out there to even share this out, because you see, especially for those immigrants that will literally come to the US and start idolizing white folks, this same white woman broke everything down in pieces. Like, she dragged history out of our wardrobe and dropped it on our doorstep. So this video is very important for a lot of Black Americans to see this, for immigrants to see this as well, and know that every single thing that you have literally been doing to Black Americans is of a total waste. You know, a lot of them idolize white folks to the point that they don't care to worship and lick the feet of white folks. But the moment Black Americans stop, you hear something like, you do not belong in this country, go to your country. You hear things like, oh, you are just living on Texas, eating free food. You hear things like Black Americans are lazy, east, west, north, and south. You hear things like they are nothing like foundational Black Americans or indigenous Black Americans that literally existed. But I want you guys to watch this video. And when you're done watching this video, let me know in the comment section if everything she said is not correct. You think the white folks are the alpha and the omega, the author and the finisher of your faith. Now, we are in the reality. Welcome to the channel. My name is Sonia. Subscribe, like, comment, and share. And credits belong to the original creators of every single clips and stitches we have in our today's episode. And with that being said, let's go in and roll out this clip. And I'll be back with commentaries. For disclaimers, this is just for educational purposes. But watch, learn, and share this video. Let's go watch.
White people did not exist before 1681. Again, white people did not exist on planet Earth until 1681. Number two, any claim that this group called white people, any claim that that group is rooted in biology or derived from genes or biology or is innate or is from nature is a lie. Third and final point, as a matter of foundational law, actually let me say it this way, white supremacy has been embedded in the United States of America from its founding as a matter of law. Now, I don't expect you to buy all that, to get all that, to believe all that, at least not now. But my job is to share with you the legal history that proves each of those three claims that I begin with. So let's go. Let's get started. We have to begin this conversation in colonial North America, specifically in the colonies, the British colonies of Maryland and Virginia. Both were British colonies, and both shared a number of particular characteristics. First, their economies were rooted in tobacco farming. If you know much about tobacco farming, it requires tremendous human labor, lots and lots of workers. So those who owned large plantations, big landholders, constantly needed laborers to do the work to grow the tobacco. In addition to sharing an economic base, both colonies had an incredible gender imbalance, roughly 10 men for every woman. Now, let's understand a little bit about the folks who constitute the people in these two colonies. Oh, and by the way, let me give you a year. We're in the early 1600s, okay, the early part of the 17th century, colonial North America. England had, for some bizarre reason that today demographers cannot explain, there was a population boom in England in the early 17th century. So there were lots and lots of poor British people who were on the public doles, who couldn't find a way to make a living, who couldn't feed themselves. So the king in England was quite happy to have them sign a contract of indenture to then go work in the British colonies. And that is what happened. Both indentured and enslaved persons, according to historian Edmund Morgan, were sold and traded like cattle. But of course, not all laborers stand equal in terms of their labor agreement or lack thereof. Those who came under a term of indenture worked for a term of years, and presumably this indenture was an agreement that they chose to enter into. The terms of indenture were largely protected by British law, although the terms that took form in colonial North America were quite different than those that existed in England. For example, in England, indentured servants could marry because that was viewed as the way to produce the next group of workers. In this country, indentured servants were prohibited from marrying, and if women were unfortunate enough to get pregnant during their term of indenture, they added usually about 7 to 9 years onto their term of indenture and 1 year to the father. Slavery, of course, was a status that came with life, work for life. There was neither British law nor international law to prohibit or restrict slavery. What we do know is that at this time period in colonial North America, there were free persons of African descent. We know that landholders freed slaves. They did so in wills. They did so by allowing them to purchase their own freedom or the freedom of a family member. The vast majority of workers, laborers, in colonial North America at this time were British men, British workers, the vast majority. There were some women, there were some European laborers from Portuguese, Dutch, folks from Ireland and from Scotland are also revealed in the records, but the vast majority were British men. There were small numbers of persons of African descent, and there were even smaller numbers of members of native tribes. But in this slide, I'm trying to capture the socioeconomic ladder, and really that ladder should be about as long as this room. The landholding elite are, in today's parlance, that's the 1%. And the vast majority of folks who were in the colonies were laborers. Again, they were British, other Europeans, Africans, and members of native tribes. Here's what I find folks have the most difficult time with. We tend to really struggle with getting a good picture of social life, the social context at this juncture. We're very good at understanding the social relations that exist later, and we'll talk about those in a moment. But pre-Bacon's Rebellion society is something that we generally in this country struggle to grasp. So I'm going to do my best to paint a broad stroke picture of this time period. What we know is that British and African laborers worked, ate, and slept together. Furthermore, the evidence from this period, which covers the first 3/4 of the 17th century, that the anecdotal evidence reveals that they lived under similar conditions and faced the same opportunities and chances to make it once one was free of their term of service, whether free of enslavement or free of indenture. So let's review this. British laborers constituted the vast majority of the populations in both colonial Maryland and colonial Virginia. All men, of course, because the law of coverture, let me tell you something about that law of coverture. The law of coverture is derived from British common law, and it structures marriage. And this is how Barrister Blackstone famously described the law of coverture. In marriage, the man and the woman become one, and the one is the man. You didn't have the right to retain your own wages. You couldn't create estate planning, wills, or trusts without the approval of a man. So all men who were free of indenture or enslavement faced the same opportunities in these colonies as a matter of law. For example, free men of African descent could own servants or slaves and they did. They could vote, and they did. They could marry persons of the opposite sex. God, and I love that I have to make that qualification now. Woo! They could marry persons of the opposite sex regardless of national origin, and they did. In fact, marriages between men of African descent and women primarily of British descent were not uncommon at all. In one county, 1/2 of the free men of African descent were married to a European woman. There was a challenge to these marriages, but it did not come from the masses. It came from elites, and that's what we're going to talk about next. All right, this little depiction is meant to be a depiction of the lawmakers in Maryland, colonial Maryland lawmakers. They passed a law in 1664 punishing, and I quote, British and other freeborn women who marry enslaved Negro men. The punishment for entering into these marriages was that the woman herself would be enslaved for her husband's life, and any children they have would be enslaved into their 20s. Now imagine that you are a plantation owner. That's not a bad deal. I get more property. I like that. And that is exactly what happened. Rather than deter these marriages, which is the express intent of the law of 1664, rather than deter them, these marriages were encouraged by property owners because that, in fact, that such a marriage increased their property value. This law of 1664 represents, if not the first, certainly the precursor to anti-miscegenation law. These are laws that punished or prohibited marriage between, notice that white people didn't exist yet in 1664, at least as referenced in that law. But most generally speaking, anti-miscegenation law prohibited and punished marriages between a white person and a specific non-white person or persons. Let me be really clear. I read all the time in history books, in academic texts, and I read anti-miscegenation law described as prohibiting interracial marriage. That's not correct. For example, a member of a native tribe could marry a person of Chinese descent. Both were understood as racially distinct, but never did anti-miscegenation law prohibit such kinds of marriages. The only marriages that anti-miscegenation law prohibited were those between a white person and always a person of African descent, and sometimes various other groups. Okay, so just so we're really clear about anti-miscegenation law and its link to whiteness. A couple other things to note about anti-miscegenation law. It's not derived from British law. Anytime we look at law and study history and you see a break from British common law, you always want to pay attention because it tells us something about the needs and desires of those who wielded power in the colonial context. So anti-miscegenation law was one of these laws. They were passed colony by colony and then state by state. It's a really important area of law for a number of reasons. But for our purpose this morning is because it's where this human category called white first appears on planet Earth, the first time. In addition, anti-miscegenation law is important because it lasted more than 300 years. These anti-miscegenation laws literally shaped the faces of this group of more than 2,000 X number of people that I'm looking at today. The Maryland legislature sought to correct for the encouragement of marriages that they described in that previous law of 1664 as, quote, a disgrace, unquote, to the British people. as an indication that the, quote, British or freeborn woman must be forgetful of her status as free, end quote. So they passed the law of 1681. And in this law, it made it illegal for British and other white women from marrying a Negro slave. And furthermore, the law punished any landholder who encouraged the marriages and any religious authority who performed it. This law equals the invention of the human category white. Did these group of laborers, some of whom were from Portugal, some from Holland, some from Ireland, Scotland, did they have a little genetic transformation that occurred right after the General Assembly in Maryland met, creating a genetic sludge that we can now call white? Virginia passed its first anti-miscegenation law in 1691. In Virginia, the law prohibited both white men and white women from marrying a person of African descent or a member of a native tribe. But lest I leave you thinking that gender equality was being created in this law, let me quickly dispel that. Studies of antebellum courts reveal that, in fact, anti-miscegenation law was that, at least in the language of the law, prohibited these marriages for white men and white women. But here's what we know from antebellum court cases. We know that plenty of white men married and or engaged in intimate sexual relations with prohibited women. However, very rarely were they brought to court and punished under the anti-miscegenation law. Very rarely. So here, pay attention to this. This law, in its enforcement, is largely focused on controlling the relationality and the sexuality of white women and non-white men. Furthermore, think about the enforcement practices that come out of this particular law. What's the result? Who becomes more available for who? We see a further step in locating patriarchal power squarely among and within white men. We've talked about the law of 1664 and the amendment to that law in 1681. And we've noted that the key difference between those two is the reference to the group who's of concern. The language has shifted from British and other freeborn to British and other white women in that particular law. So the question becomes, well, what the heck happened between 1664 and 1681? And the answer is Bacon's Rebellion. This was a massive revolt in the colony of Virginia that lasted more than a year. all financial assets and land. The man had the control. But the exchange was that in exchange for that authority, he protects. That's the trade-off for patriarchal power. Stripped, made impossible by virtue of this law. And then let's look at this law that prohibited blacks from testifying against whites. We will see that throughout U.S. history. Mexicans prohibited from testifying against whites, Chinese prohibited from testifying against whites, and then it just becomes mongrels, the label, to include persons of Japanese descent and the like. So that's a law that we see throughout U.S. history. When you look at these laws, what's the message to white people? Each one of these laws has a message to this new group of people called white folks, on the one hand, and a message to those who it denies or restricts on the other. Each one of them. This package of laws, first passed after Bacon's Rebellion, did something extraordinary. Let's imagine that that light up there represents the landholding elite, the 1%. And this represents the socioeconomic ladder in the colony, okay? And so this hand over here represents this new group of laborers called white ones. And this hand over here represents laborers of African descent and members of native tribes. Before Bacon's Rebellion and through it, these laborers had the same lives, faced the same opportunities, and that changed. But when you look at these laws that passed that created this change, it divided these, created different meaning for this group versus this group, but it didn't do a whole lot to lift the economic status of white people closer to that of the white elites. Very little movement up. What it did do was it plummeted the bottom, created a new bottom to colonial society, and shoved persons of African descent and members of native tribes there. So let's look at this group of humanity called white people. We learn from this history that white people were built upon the idea that British had of themselves as white, as Christian, as freeborn, as deserving of rights and privileges from which others can be denied. To this day, white people have not been defined as a matter of law to this day. This history teaches us that white is the tool by which laborers were divided. Those who shared the same living conditions, the same opportunities, now experience ourselves as more connected with Paris Hilton than with our African American neighbor, even though our economic status is far more similar to that neighbor than to the lives of the 1%. But not only did this new organization of society create a new bottom to it, it created a link that heretofore had not existed, that connected this new group of laborers called white people with the elite. And what was that connection? This shared status called white, embedded with the presumption of its superiority. The other thing to note about the invention of white people and the meaning of white that this history reveals is that white constituted the center of patriarchal power. And we see that most clearly through anti-miscegenation law and specifically through its enforcement. We're going to move from the 17th century into the 18th century. The American Revolution has taken place, and the First Congress of the United States of America will meet for the first time. And when they meet, they will establish laws regarding citizenship in this new country. This is the building actually in New York where the first Congress met. Here are the men who represented the first Congress. These laws regarding citizenship include an area of law called naturalization law. Naturalization law provides the process by which one who is not born in a country can become a citizen. The first Congress of the United States determined 1790 that in order to become a naturalized citizen of this new republic called the United States of America, one had to be white. This was valid law in the United States until 1952. You had to be white to be a U.S. citizen. 1952. Now, as is often the case, laws impact those who are gendered female differently than those who are gendered male. No less true with the naturalization law. For example, white women who were citizens, if they dared to marry a man who was ineligible for citizenship via the naturalization law, in other words, he wasn't white, she loses her citizenship. These laws work to make white women most available to white men, and frankly, all women available to white men. The requirement of whiteness in naturalization law has had a significant impact on various groups of people who've come to the United States of America. In fact, the naturalization law was a significant piece of evidence used in the Plessy versus Ferguson case in 1896 to determine that U.S. citizenship status and therefore the protections of the constitutions were never intended to be applied to persons of African descent. Naturalization law assured that the masses of Chinese laborers and then Japanese laborers and then various other groups of laborers who came to this country would remain cheap, dependent labor. Why? Because even though they were significant in number, especially relative to their employer and landholders and railroad companies, if you're not white, you're not a U.S. citizen. If you're not a U.S. citizen, you don't vote. If you can't vote, you can't voice your political needs and desires, thereby reducing these groups of people to dependent, cheap labor. In addition, naturalization law was used to block persons of Chinese and Japanese and Filipinos, and we could go on, various groups. Not only did it result in them getting paid less for doing the same job, but all kinds of taxes got imposed upon them. So there was a foreign wage tax, various laws were passed that blocked them from being able to work in the public sector, blocked them from being able to hold a managerial position, and then of course alien land laws were passed. These were laws that made it illegal for those ineligible for naturalization, i.e. not white people, made it illegal for them to own property. And so what's the result of these laws for white people, right? Because we're real good about seeing the harm that these laws cause for certain groups. But let's get the flip side of that coin. When I make land, when I make a whole group of people ineligible to purchase land, it makes more land available and cheaper for me, for white people. When you're the lowest paid worker and prohibited from moving up as a matter of law, then those positions that get paid more, that are more desirable, are more available to white people. So we see, just from this one law, and I could spend another hour with you at least going through these combinations of law, naturalization law, anti-miscegenation law, and immigration policy, all that combined in these ways to continue to advantage, to give economic value, symbolic value to white people, to give us the unearned advantages that we continue to receive today. I have a favor to ask. Would y'all close your eyes for a moment? Let's close your eyes. Imagine a society where white supremacy is not embedded in our institutions. Sit with it. Think of the prison complex. Think of our education system. Think of church on Sunday, synagogue on Saturday, temple, mosque. Think about the organization of neighborhoods. Think about the government of the United States and how assets and resources would be distributed. Looks pretty different, doesn't it? White supremacy, you can open your eyes if you like, is institutionally embedded in the United States of America as a matter of foundational law. So what do? Whatever image you had of an institution, an example, a relationship that was free of institutionalized and personally held on to white supremacy, hold that. Hold on to it. It's a glimpse, it's a tool to tell us where we need to go, where we can go. It offers hope.
Anyways, welcome back. Welcome back. And that is all I got for this video. And honestly, there is nobody that will tell me that what this woman is saying is not correct or what this woman is saying is not right. And I hope a lot of people are able to learn from this. Now, before the Europeans arrive, indigenous nations have already built complex society across America. The Mississippi civilization, the Hunksdo, I don't know if I'm pronouncing this well, sorry, I can't pronounce it very well. The ancestral problems as well, Pueblos. They had government, they had trade system, they had agriculture, they had cities, they had law. So the land has become the United States already, had foundation long before Columbus and before the arrival of the European. Now, Christopher Columbus reached the Caribbeans in 1492. He never stepped foot on what is now mainland United States. He opened the door for European colonization, but he did not find America as a country. European settlers, mainly British, created the colony that later became the United States. Important milestones like Jamestown in 1607, Mayflower in 1620, Declaration of Independence in 1776, and U.S. Constitution in 1787. The founding father, mostly European descendant men, built the early political system. Millions of enslaved Africans were now forced to build the economic backbone of the early America. They built plantation, cotton, tobacco, rice, infrastructures, wealth for white landowners, much of the earlier southern economy. Without enslaved labor, early Americans' wealth wouldn't have grown the same way. But foundational Black Americans have already been there even before all of this. Indigenous people, first civilization and land ownership and land stewardship built America. Europeans just brought political structures and colonization. Then enslaved Black people joined hands for mass economic labor foundation. Immigrants like Irish, Chinese, Italians built railway industries and cities. Americans was built through colonization, forced labor, immigration, innovation, complex, and compromise. In early days, foundational Black Americans, who are the indigenous people, were the first people who economically built much of their early wealth even before the enslaved Americans. You know, when people get to America and they want to just get their greenest pasture, they think that the white folks are the Alpha and the Omega. And that is why it is important, especially for those of you migrating from one country to another, that you do your research very well and understand the particular place you are going to. A lot of you guys look down on Black Americans because you guys think that Black Americans have nothing to offer. Black Americans has nothing to bring to the table, or Black Americans are lazy, or Black Americans are not worth giving my respect, while at the end of the day, they paved way for you to be there. They made things happen for you to be there. They made things work for you to be there. And that is why a lot of you that did not understand this structure are falling into the wrong hands. I can tell you for a whole fact, if you take your time to study Black American history very well, that is why you will notice that a lot of them, they don't want to give them opportunities, because they knew that the moment they start giving Black Americans opportunities, Black Americans will literally take over. Black Americans are fighters. Black Americans are builders. Black Americans are people that once you give them things, things grow in their hands. That is why when I saw this woman saying all of this, I actually wanted to bring it down to our table so that we can both digest it and understand. But let me know what you think in the comment section. Do you think everything this woman said is wrong? Do you think everything she said is right? I want to know your honest comments in the comment section. And if you haven't subscribed, what are you waiting for? Please do what? Subscribe, like this video, drop me your comments, and lastly, do not forget to share for every other person to get this good news. I want to say a very big thank you to every single one of you liking, commenting, sharing my videos, dropping super thanks, joining my membership. I really appreciate you guys, and I do not take you guys for granted. I love you from the depth of my heart. Okay, anyways, with that being said, with no further ado, I do act like I always say in my videos, I'm going to be saying bye, and I'll see you guys in my next one. For now, bye guys, I love you guys.